First of all, I just want to thank everybody for joining us. I am sure you've been having an amazing time at the symposium this week and the conference this week, but this is a very special panel. I am honored to have the opportunity to be in conversation with one of my earliest mentors as it relates to narrative and autoethnography. Um, Chris Poulos taught me a class during my first semester as a graduate student, and that was instructive. And I am honored that so many years later, I won't say how many years later, that we have continued on this journey in many ways together. So I have some questions that kind of reflect my own curiosities about his journey. And I invite you guys to come up with your own questions because we should have time at the end to entertain them as well. So, are you ready, CP? Okay. Okay.
Absolutely.
So, can you start by telling us a bit about your background? Where you're from, what degrees you've earned, what you wanted to be when you grow up.
Yeah. Well, first, I want to say thank you to Keith and Tony and Carolyn and Art and whoever else had this idea to do this, and to Robin, of course, for agreeing to do it. I don't know. I honestly don't know whether to feel honored or old, but I'm going to go with honored. Um, so, where am I from? That's a thorny question in itself. My dad was a restless kind of guy, so and I'm not, this is real. In my first 4 years of life, we lived in something like 12 different houses in 3 different towns. Um, and then, so the where I'm from, that was in Northeast Georgia. I was born in a place called Carrollton, Georgia, which is west of Atlanta. But I mean, Northwest Georgia is where we spent much of our time. And then my dad decided to switch careers and become an Episcopal priest. So we went to seminary in Sewanee, which is the University of the South. What it is basically a college campus on a mountaintop, um, which happens to have an Episcopal seminary attached to it. So I lived on a college campus from the time I was 4 through the time I was almost 7. So kindergarten, first and second grade were formative years, and that's really when my narrative memory kind of started life. So I have snatches before that, but I would call, if I had to say where I'm from, I would say Sewanee, which I think imprinted on me as I've stayed the rest of my life on college and university campuses without ever really leaving. Um, as a kid, I in Sewanee, to give you the picture, it's on a mountaintop and it's a campus that's 13,000 acres, so it's quite large. Most of that is forest. Um, and so the actual buildings of the campus, we lived in a graduate student housing on the campus. The actual buildings part of it is small. The forest part of it is huge. And so I spent a lot of time wandering around in the woods as a little kid. Um, and then my dad, when he got his first job out of seminary, we moved to Atlanta, and I spent many of my formative years there. And then later we moved to North Carolina, and that's part of my later story about coming back to North Carolina. But so the degrees part, I think this is related to one of your other questions. I really just was like a kid wandering in the forest. I went. I had a moment after high school where I decided to take a year off and work instead of going straight into college. I wasn't sure who I was, or I was 17. I graduated early because I was the youngest in my class always. So I was standing in a lumber yard where I was making $2.70 an hour, loading boards onto a forklift, thinking there has to be more to life than this. When I looked down at my feet and saw that they were frozen into the mud, it was January in North Georgia, in a place called Kennesaw, North Atlanta. And I looked down at my feet and said, "Oh, look, a metaphor." And the guy across from me was a sixth grade graduate who had been working in the lumberyard his entire adult life. And he said, "A what?" And I said, "Oh, never mind." That night, I went to the library, which is what we did at the time, pre-internet days. I went to the library to look up all the different programs I might get into for college that were somewhere along the line. I had read Go West, Young Man, that were in Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, Oregon, or Washington, or Idaho. That's where I wanted to go, to the mountains of the West. I guess the mountains of Sewanee had also imprinted on me. So I found a place called Colorado Mountain College, and as a solid, barely 18-year-old's decision, I chose that school based on the photograph on the cover of the catalog, which was a mountain jumping up out behind the buildings. That happens to be the highest mountain in the continental U.S. Mount outside of California. It's Mount Elbert. It's the highest in the Rocky Mountain chain. And basically, I just thought, well, that looks like a good place to be. So what I did was I signed up for a program in outdoor leadership, because I'd always been into backpacking and hiking and spending time in the forest and all that sort of stuff. And during my 2 years there, I was taking that degree, that associate's degree in outdoor leadership, but I had a philosophy professor who I was sitting in class one day, and he was going on about Socrates, and I just had this kind of epiphany. That was what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a professor. I didn't even know what that meant or how to do that, but I knew that's what I wanted to do. So when I left Colorado Mountain College, I went to Boulder and got a degree in philosophy. But philosophy alone wasn't enough for me, so I designed my own degree in philosophy and film and the arts. And so, and that's linked back to my love of movie going. Anyway, I got a degree in philosophy, then I got a job, because that's what you do when you're highly employable as a philosophy graduate, right? You get a job at a mutual fund company, and working in customer service. And so as I'm sitting there taking nasty phone calls from angry customers and thinking there must be more to life than this, I, I start to explore and think about what's next, right? And so I end up getting another job in a similar company, another financial services company. And one of the things that had struck me as fascinating was, why would my dad throw away his pharmacy degree, where he was bound to make a lot of money and do well, and he liked doing pharmacy, to go to seminary? So I thought, well, one way to figure that out would be to take a degree in religious studies. So I got a master's degree in religious studies. Um, and that was a whole journey in itself. It got me into something I'll talk about later, a book that I love, some books that I love that have impacted my life. But so master's degree in religious studies. Well, what's next is obvious, right? You poke around the neighborhood and figure out what's next. While I'm working for this financial services company, I'm a um, training and development guy. I work in organizational development. And there's a guy, we hire a guy from the University of Denver who comes in to facilitate, to mediate really a giant argument among a bunch of managers. And he's a Ph.D. in communication, a professor in communication. And I start talking to him afterwards, after this session where he worked his magic, and I'm like, sort of, he kind of helped fix the problem that these people were having. And I was like, oh, so, what do you do? And we talked, and he said, you should look at our doctoral. I told him what I was interested in. And he said, you should look at our doctoral program. So the next thing I know, I'm in a PhD in communication studies, never having taken a communication class in my life, in any of those other degrees. But I was fascinated by what was next. So that's a long way of saying that's how I got the degrees. And then what I wanted to be when I grew up, well, I wanted to be a spy, because the best shows on TV when I was a little kid were Man from Uncle and Get Smart and all these spy shows from the Cold War era, right? And so I got a Man from Uncle spy kit, and it was all fascinating and everything. I got a periscope that I could look in my neighbor's windows with, and I really wanted to be a spy. That sort of faded into baseball dreams. I wanted to be a baseball player. which somewhere in the middle there, I wanted to be a pirate and a cowboy, or an astronaut. So I wanted to be a space pirate cowboy, I think. And then somewhere I landed on being a writer, like wanting to be a writer. And that one sort of stuck, I guess, around. The one that stuck around was the writing. And I started writing at a really young age. I was, so if you think I'm good at it, it's only because I've been practicing since I was 6, right? Like, regularly. Um, I don't know if I'm good at it or not, but I do know that sticking with it has been the lifeblood for me of everything I do. I was saying yesterday in a session, just in response to a session, that I really identify as a writer who happens to traffic in communication studies, not the other way around. So, um, yeah, that's kind of what I have for those
That.
questions.
So I definitely have identified a few thread throughs that I think we'll get back to, or just that I know of. I'm thinking here generationally of how some of your aspirations have kind of transcended to your children, and I'm also thinking of that there's probably nothing closer to a spy than an ethnographer. So perhaps
Yeah.
you did quite closely follow your dreams. So you said that you had a degree in philosophy and film.
Yeah.
What is the role of philosophy in your worldview?
Well, I think it's all, so I was, I think you're going to ask me about sort of, and I've already sort of alluded to kind of stumbling into things, like falling into things that I didn't know were
Mhm.
there. When I happened to hit the University of Colorado, what was hot at the time was, this was the early 1980s, was existentialist philosophy, um, from continental Europe. And one of my teachers there was Hazel Barnes, who was, the translator of Sartre's Being and Nothingness, and an author of several really good books herself, but one of the most masterful teachers I've ever seen. I've rarely seen a person who could hold a lecture audience spellbound for a full hour without anybody hardly even breathing, but she could do it. She was a genius at really at explaining such a complex philosophy in ways that people could really grasp, that I could really grasp. And we're reading Being and Nothingness, which is an 850-page book, a tome really, and very thick and very impenetrable. But I'm also hearing her without her lectures, I probably would have failed to understand it. As my friend Michael Hyde, who teaches at Wake Forest, said, French philosophers' number one goal is to, excuse my language, to fuck with your head. Um, but so that I think stumbling into Hazel Barnes's realm, and then also I was doing the thing of like, so back at the time at that university, everything came out on paper, and you got a little if you wanted to do a registration, you had to stand in line with a computer card and fill, it was like that. Nothing was automated. So there was this book that would come out, and before classes would start, that would have all the courses listed, and occasionally I would just point to something and figure out that's what I wanted to take. There were categories, right? So I managed to get into a film history class, and that took me all the way back to Sewanee, because the one thing I didn't mention about Sewanee was you could walk to the movie theater, from the on-campus movie theater, from my house on a Saturday morning, and for $1 you could get a popcorn, a candy bar, and a Coke, and a movie ticket, um, for $1 as a little kid, and the movie would be a full-length Warner Brothers cartoon, a Bugs Bunny or a Roadrunner or something like that, a B-level cowboy movie, and then something sort of not quite top-notch Hollywood but still watchable, and then the main feature. And you could spend the whole rainy afternoon, or foggy in Sewanee, it tended to be foggy afternoon, doing that. So I was a moviegoer from very early. So I sort of looped back into it with the film thing. I sort of accidentally stumbled into it, and but I think most of my work has been grounded. And I do want to give a shout out to Alec Grant's latest collection, one of his collections, the Writing Philosophical Autoethnography. Art has a piece in there, I have a piece in there. Um, I think that's a kind of it's a very cool sort of way of coming to grips with grounding autoethnography in a kind of a deep philosophical tradition. And for me, that's existentialism, because that was the highest influence on my life. But also other things like, in communication, social construction, this philosophy of Calvin Schrag and John Stewart, not the comedian, the philosopher of communication, um, and people like that, John Schotter. Um, and I do tend to go back to those people a lot. I go back to Camus and Sartre a lot. I do go back also to some of the people that I studied in the religious studies master's degree, Carl Jung and Walker Percy, who was also an existentialist novelist. So they're always, if you read my stuff, you'll see that that's where, and also the religious historian Mircea Eliade, those people are always sort of threaded through my stuff. I try to tell my students, they struggle with this idea of like connecting autoethnography to some literature that makes sense to you or that helps you make sense of your world. And I say, well, you have to read enough to be grounded enough in something to where it becomes part of you to the point where it's not a struggle to connect up your theoretical or philosophical um, foundations, if you will. I mean, Keith does this with Buddhism and things like that, mindfulness and stuff like that. You do it with Black feminist scholarship. We all have like our touchstones, our places that we go to, and I think it's important to get there, but I think for a 20-year-old, it might be hard to get there. If somebody had asked me to do this when I was 20, I would have said that's preposterous, but I would have done it anyway, which is what they do, you know.
Right.
Um, but which is good, right?
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. Because it is, as you said, as you kind of alluded to, a practice.
Yeah.
Um, so thinking about this, the journey of your work and kind of here, now, past, present, future. Compare your dissertation. Tell us about your dissertation and compare that to your most recent work, whatever you're working on currently or you most recently published. It may have been this piece you just referenced. And talk to us a little bit about what is consistent about your work and curiosities and what is inherently different from when you wrote a dissertation and what you're actively working on now.
Well, when I was writing my dissertation, radicals like Carolyn Ellis and Bud Goodall and those people were breaking into the scene of autoethnography and really paving new pathways. But it wasn't accepted widely the way it is now. It wasn't. We did not have a handbook. We did not have much. I mean, we had not much to go on, right, in our field. So when I wrote my dissertation, I pretty much grounded it, and this is related to my sort of background in existentialism and phenomenology. Um, I wrote it as a phenomenological piece, a kind of philosophical meditation on what I called leaping toward infinity, which is a kind of trying to understand something I'm still working with, which is how do you communicate that which is ineffable, right? The gaps between our understanding and our ability to say, or like our intuitive understanding of something and our ability to say it into speaking or writing. That was what I was working with. So it wasn't easy. It was nearly impossible to pitch an autoethnography at that point, but it wasn't hard to pitch a phenomenology. So what I did was I used Emmanuel Levinas for the sort of ethical grounding in the other, and I used Maurice Merleau-Ponty for this notion of being connected with the world around us, this phenomenology of perception, right? And I
Mhm.
used them as grounding for my answer to sort of Descartes' dictum of "I think, therefore I am." I always suspected that was off base, that was wrong. And so what I came up with was um, communicarius ergo somos. We communicate, therefore we are, right? And this was sort of in the middle of, I also used social construct, the bursting on the scene of social constructionist philosophy or theories into communication studies was also happening in the early and mid 1990s, at the same time that sort of autoethnography was coming into being. And there's Ken Gergen and from social psychology, and John Schotter from that same area, and then, as I mentioned, Calvin Schrag from philosophy of communication, and John Stewart from philosophy of communication. So I was using all those people to have this conversation. What I did was I did 3 what we were calling phenomenological case studies. One was children on a playground. 2 was rituals in the Episcopal Church that I had grown up with, the people that actually performed the rituals, the ministers that were doing the communion ritual, and the people in the audience. And then the third was in the organization I was working with, which was this financial services trust company, and organizational meetings in that space. And sort of trying to figure out, the typical, I always say, and this is not a joke, my one research question is, what the hell's going on around here? Right? That's all I got. Like, I don't, and I often don't know until I'm there and I'm in it and I'm writing it. So that was the dissertation. I haven't, I didn't turn that into a book. I didn't continue it. I don't know about you, but I wrote a 320-page dissertation. By the time it was done, I was done. And I have to give a little disclaimer there. Like, when I did this, I was working full time. I was teaching at the university. I was taking a full-time Ph.D., and I had 2 babies in my house. My son Noah was born the January before I started my doctoral program. My son Eli was born 3.5 years before that. But so I had these 2 little kids. I basically did all this. I did all the writing and the work at night after they went to bed. And my strategy was, because Noah was like an Energizer Bunny kid, like he would only pass out if you wore him out. So my strategy would literally be to run them around the backyard until they were totally exhausted, so we could get them in bed by 7 o'clock. So I would have from 7 to midnight, and then from 4 a.m. till they woke up to do the writing part of the dissertation. I somehow gave myself a sleep disorder doing all that, but I also got it done. So it's a long way of saying I think I still go back to it in my heart and in my mind, but I've also at the same time moved on, um, and sort of still continued to really just follow my nose to wherever I go, and that might get into the way I approach writing. We can talk about if we have time. But
So, did you want to speak to what you're currently writing and its relationship to that,
oh, was that part of the
or your most
question?
recent work?
Sorry.
Mhm.
Uh, well, the connection might be really simple. Like, the thing I'm working on right now is this kind of idea of, I've been sort of, I don't want to say obsessed, but I've been taken by this idea of liminal spaces and thresholds between um, space between this and that. In the previous session um, with Mike Alvarez about suicide, I was thinking about the thin line, really, the thin place between what we call sanity and what we call madness, right? Or what we call mental health and what we call and it seems like, and what we call good mental health and versus what we call bad mental health. And it feels to me like, especially since the pandemic, that space has gotten smaller, that we might all be sort of cutting along that edge. There's a playwright, Christopher Fry, who writes about comedy versus tragedy, and he says, there's really just a razor's edge between tragedy and comedy, right? I feel that, like, but I've been fascinated with these liminal spaces, particularly between memory and forgetting, between dreaming and waking, between what I was talking about communication and that which comes before it, um,
Mhm.
and sort of these threshold spaces where we're not quite where we want to get to yet, and how do we write our way through that. I'm calling it echoes of the past, as you know, like a kind of an echo metaphor, that sort of, when you call out across, like I live near the mountains of North Carolina, you can go places where you can call out across a valley and get an echo coming back, right? um, at least sometimes of the year, especially this time of year where the foliage hasn't gotten so thick. But that space between the calling out and the echo coming back is kind of fascinating to me as a metaphor for what we face in sort of everyday life, right? So that's kind of, I
Yeah.
know it sounds a lot like I'm saying something that can't be said, and I think you know, there is a sense in which it can't be written, but I want to
Mm.
anyway.
Yeah. I like that. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So I'm getting the theme of metaphors of the ineffable. Um, so I'm going to skip around in terms of the questions a little bit.
Okay.
You've made reference to stumbling into things, and I think autoethnography may be one of those. So I would love for you to share that story. How did you stumble into autoethnography, and what other things have you stumbled into in terms of your career? So if you could just maybe speak to the role of happenstance in your
Yeah.
career
So
trajectory.
the first part of that, the stumbling into autoethnography, that's a simple story. Like, I was in this PhD in communication studies, and like I had said, I'd never read anything in communication literature before. And the first class I'm taking is all this quantitative stuff, which I could not make heads or tails of. It seemed to me that a lot of those people were much more enamored with the statistical power of what they were doing than they were with the questions they were asking. And that might have just been my naive misreading, but I definitely was not taken by that literature. I was not swept up in it, or I was not having it. I was not having a good time with it. So I went to my advisor and I said, I think I might have made a mistake, as if enrolling in this program, if this is all we have, I'm going to be in trouble. I don't think I can be a status. I just don't think I have the statistical mind. I don't think I can go there. That I'm a literary guy, I'm a philosophical guy, I'm a word person. I know that's a, I think of, when I say that, I think of that as a kind of expression of a lack, but actually it's just my preference.
Mhm.
And so when I said that to him, he says, "Hold on a second." He hands me Bud Goodall's book, Casing a Promised Land, which was relatively new at the time, right? And he says, "Here, take this home and read it, and come back." And so I took Casing Promised Land home, and I read it. And for those of you who don't know, this is an organizational communication study written in the form of a detective novel, sort of
Mhm.
modeled on the work of Raymond Chandler, which I was all about. And I read that thing in one sitting, and I went back and I said, "Can I do this?" And he said, "I think you can." Um, because he knew I could write. And so that's what I did. Now along the way, and I shared this in the session on remembering Norman Denzin the other day. Um, Along the way, I stumbled into this qualitative methods class where our assignment was to do a field ethnography of something in our community, observe something in your community, and write about that. Find a unique space that you can
Yeah.
inhabit, and go there and do this field ethnography. So I went to I happened you heard about how complicated my life was. I've always worked out at the gym, and so I went to this Jewish community center that I worked out at, thinking I was going to maybe do it seemed pretty pedestrian to do a kind of ethnography of a fitness club, right? So, but I walked in there one day and I realized there's something right here that's not in those spaces usually. It's a Jewish community center, and they do this thing called spitzing. And this, basically, it was like old men, like 70 years and up, sitting in a superheated sauna for a really long time, and taking turns getting bathed by another Jewish man with this, like, palm branch called it's raffia. They call it the broom, and they dip it in this sudsy water, this warm soapy water, and they slap it or rub on these naked pink 70-year-old bodies, and then and these men stand, and I'm sitting in the sauna, this the only goy in the room, and that's what they refer to me as, the goy. Um, the goy boy. I'm over in the corner watching this stuff. It's very different for me. It's not the space it's not a space I've ever inhabited. I just happened to stumble into it. But they go, and then they, after the bathing part, they dump cold water, a bucket of cold water over them, and then they walk out into the lounge naked as jaybirds, sit down on a chair and dry and let themselves air dry while they gamble and schmooze and vetch and talk about their cruises and all that other stuff, bet on football games, whatever they're doing. But I was really I was intrigued by this as a site that I could go to with my complicated life on the regular and observe. And before I knew it, they're sort of sidling up next to me, telling me about the history of this practice and the different variations of this practice and where this practice came from. And many of them were very clear to make sure I understood that this was not a homosexual thing. They were, these elderly Jewish men did not want to be, some of them did not want to be identified with that. As they didn't want me to think I was in a gay bathhouse, I guess. I don't know. But like, they were, they're telling me the history, they're telling me all this stuff. So I wrote this piece and I sent it off to Norman Dinsen. And in typical Dinsen style, this is like, this is also when we're just all getting email, right? So like, but he sends back this thing. He says, "Bravo." I'm like, okay, like, uh, uh, does that mean something? He wrote these. I don't, as those of you who emailed him know, he wrote like these one sentence emails with, just like very quick stuff. So I said, is that an acceptance? Well, there were a few like variations that he needed me to put in, but it got published while I was in grad school. That was my first publication, was this study of schwitzing. Now, it was largely a philosophical ethnography. When I first wrote it, I had some autoethnographic reflections in there on being the guy in the room with these people. They actually, the reviewers made me cut those out. I guess they weren't very good. Honestly, don't have copies of them anymore, so I don't know whether they were. All I have is the article that got published. But it got published in a research volume called Cultural Studies, that he was publishing at the time. But so that was my stumbling into Norman Dinsen, and and from then on, I would just send him stuff, and he would just say accepted, or yes, or bravo, or thank you, or something like that, and published a lot of things without, and I don't know how this happens, but without revisions, like just published things that I wrote and sent to him in Qualitative Inquiry and other outlets. But so he was like an accidental constant supporter of my work, that I have a lot of gratitude for. Similarly, I met Art because I wrote a piece that was put up for the Bachner and Ellis Award, and he came up to me and just thanked me for writing it and congratulated me on writing it. And I only knew these people sort of peripherally through Bud, because the other thing that I forgot to say was stumbling into Bud Goodall, that book. 4 years later, he hired me into the job at UNC Greensboro, and he was my department head for a couple of years before he went to Arizona State. He was the one who mentored Robin and introduced me to Robin, and also we stayed friends. And I actually feel it's very interesting. He did this little thing when he was dying. He put my name. He forwarded his emails and all his contacts to my email. So I got an email last week soliciting, "Dear Dr. Goodall, would you like to publish in X journal?" Right? Like, but also he put me down as his posthumous editor. So like, after he died, he still had some things in the pipeline, and I didn't know he had done. The thing about Bud, he didn't tell me he did this. So I just get this email from this publication saying, "Dear Dr. Goodall, your page proofs are ready. We need you to look at the page proofs." And I'm like, "What the hell?" And
Mm.
that happened like 4 or 5 times. So that's where these like
And
fortuitous, synchronistic,
yeah,
coincidental connections come into play and stay.
and
Um,
stay.
yeah,
Yeah, my favorite is, of course, that you are now in the office that he occupied at the desk that he wrote at,
yes, and
continuing
the
to make that
same desk,
magic at
the
UNCG.
desk, the desk that'll never be moved because it's so big. In his style, he ordered the largest possible desk, right? It's like this huge thing. You'd have to saw it into pieces to get it out of there. Like, I don't even know. It hasn't moved in 24 years. Like, so yes, I'm still in there. Yeah.
Love that. Okay. So I want to ask about your favorite books or your favorite writing. So I'm going to ask two questions as it relates to that. What is the favorite thing you've ever read? And then what is the favorite thing you've ever written and why?
I gotta tell you, that first question is really unfair. That's mean. Have you seen my book collection? Like, it's
I
ridiculous.
have actually.
It's like huge. And that's only part of it. But I would say um, two favorites that I've read. One is one that's continued to have an impact on me. I think mostly because I identified with it as a young man on a search, and it's The Moviegoer by Walker Percy. It won the National Book Award in 1960, and it's a novel about a young man wandering around trying to figure out my research question: what the hell's going on around here?
Mhm.
And he finds it in communication finally, and in love. And the other, I just have to say this: I'm gonna call you out, Robin. Sweetwater is still one of my favorite books ever. Um, and for the
Excellent.
opposite reason, really. I mean, the same beautiful writing, just really beautiful writing. But you evoke a community that I had no experience with, and I think I said this to you when you published it. uh, like I had no experience with a rural small town black community in the South that you grew up in. I'm a suburban kid from Atlanta, from suburban Atlanta. Never even lived in a city or really a small town. I lived on a college campus for a while, yeah, but but somehow I felt your characters as if they were my friends, neighbors, and family members, right? And that's a testament to the power of your writing. I hope you do more magic like that in the coming years because it's really beautiful stuff. And I'm not kidding around. I really believe that. That is a beautiful book. There are a whole bunch of others, but those are two of my favorites.
Okay. Well, what about what is your favorite thing that you have,
Well,
because
like it's
that's just as big of a collection as your book collection.
yeah,
So,
not quite, but like I think it's funny because I wrote some of the titles down that connect to your question about stumbling. These
mhm,
aren't my favorites, but these names tell you a lot. Accidental ethnography, accidental dialogue, stumbling into relating, life interrupted, disruption, silence, and creation, spirited accidents, the death of ordinariness. I could go on. There are like a lot of them that are all about that sort of like I'm not really knowing where I'm going to go, but I get there and find myself in this new place. I would say the stuff I've written, the one that was the most fun to write was my revenge piece. Actually, it's not revenge, but transgressions. It's the performance article I wrote about my tenure problem, right?
mhm,
And I say I really say honestly, it was fun to write, not because it was like lampooning the tenure process, though it was, but because here's what happened. I tried really hard to write that as a straight narrative, and I couldn't do it. It is the first time I really ever been stymied by something. It was so painful and so awful, this vote against me at tenure, that I just couldn't get myself to write the narrative. So I just threw it away. I gave up. And then one day I walked into my office and I sat down at the computer and I started writing this performance autoethnography in which I used I posed the tenure committee at the college as the as a Greek chorus, and I use elements of Shakespearean tragedy and Kafka's The Trial and the Greek chorus as a way of sort of poking fun at the tenure process. And then the beautiful part of this was that, I got tenure. I won the fight back with the tenure thing. And when I went up for full professor, um, a few years later, one of the people on the committee sent me a quiet, sort of side email saying, "Wow, I just read your transgressions piece. Good on you. I can't wait to see the reaction to this one." Because they're going to have to read about themselves, right? So that one was fun to read, to write. And then the one called Accidental Dialogue, for a different reason, it was in communication theory. And for those of you who know communication theory, it was not only unusual for an autoethnography to show up in communication theory, it was the first one that was an autoethnography in communication theory, right? I was very proud of that. And then I guess most substantive is my book, Accidental Ethnography, which I got to say, without Art Bachner, I would never have been able to do that. He was a masterful editor and supportive and hard and all the things that you could expect from an editor. At one point, Art Bachner, who I think of as the Prince of Darkness, right, who wrote a piece called Suffering Happiness, right, told me my book was way too dark and we needed some hope in there. Like, I was like, "You're not wrong. Let me think about that." And so I tried to write some hope into the end of it, which I think I did. But that one, so this is an interesting thing, and I'd never expected this, that most of the reading of that is happening now, like 15 years later. Like more people are reading it now than were reading it at the time. So that's kind of fun, and
I
citing
love
it
that.
and all that sort of
I
stuff.
love those answers. So we are nearing the end of our time, and I want to make sure that I have an opportunity to open up for at least a couple of questions from the audience. But I want to ask one final question while they are coming up with their questions, and we have 8 minutes. So I want you to answer this one fairly quickly,
Mhm.
whatever
Yeah,
first comes to mind. But I've been
I
thinking
talk
a
too
lot
much.
about legacy lately. What do you think is the legacy that you inherited and the legacy that you're leaving as it relates to autoethnography and narrative?
Wow. So I think, Art and Carolyn and Bud and all the people, Norman, all the people that came before me into this, I feel like I wrote a piece about at QI walking between Laurel Richardson and Bud Goodall on the way to lunch one day. And I called it a giant sandwich. For those of you who haven't seen me in real life, I'm shorter in real life than I am on Zoom. They're taller in real life. There's these two tall people and these giants in the field I'm walking between. And the same as Norman Denson, the same as Art Bachner, the same as Carolyn Ellis. When I met these people, I was still starstruck, but they all treated me as though I was one of them from the very beginning. And I think that's the legacy, these communities that have been built around that Norman built, that Tony and Carolyn and Art are building with these conferences, these connections, and this way of what Levinas really thought of as the welcome, the complete and total hospitality of these spaces is really a beautiful thing in an academic environment that can be brutal. It's the opposite of my tenure experience, um, and sometimes the opposite of my daily experience. My university is currently going through program review and elimination of departments and programs. It's really awful. But these spaces, that's the legacy. And then there are students out there. I'll wrap this up real quickly. Students out there like you and a whole bunch of others who are now Armand Towns, regardless of whether they're doing autoethnography or not, are part of the legacy of like teaching and having students become colleagues and then move past us and, all that beautiful stuff that happens. That's kind of the alchemy of all this. I think it's quite beautiful.
I love this conversation. I love you so much. We
Oh,
have 5 minutes. I want
sorry,
to invite
I talked too
anyone who
much.
has, oh no, this is good time, I think. We just have to have really succinct responses. But if anyone has a question, and Ron, please
Yeah,
ask your question.
thank you, Robin. Uh, Chris, I, I said to you maybe 2 or 3 conventions ago that one of the things that really struck me about your more recent work is that you seem to have had a tonal shift. That there was a time that I kind of associated some of your work as kind of bullets being fired out, ricocheting around the room. And more recently, your work seems to be a heck of a lot more invitational. It seems to be a little bit softer. And I would love to hear you talk about that and talk about if you think that's true, and whether or not, where's that coming from?
Yeah, I do think that's true. Thanks, Ron. It's because I'm softening. And I attribute that to therapy, a lot of therapy and a lot of work on the sort of anger and darkness and stuff that I held inside me from my past. A lot of hard work on cleaning that all up and becoming softer. And I'll add, that like the bullets were flying during the Trump administration. And if you don't, I don't know how many people know this, but I was writing a daily haiku, and usually they were pretty harsh about that man. But it was therapeutic for me, and it helped me soften up even on that. And I just think I've used the writing and the actual sort of professional therapy as ways to clear some of that, and I don't feel that. And part of it was I use comedy. I've used a lot of comedy therapy to get me to more in a more lighter mood and a softer mood. I've tried to move from tragedy over into comedy as much as I can in my life, which is, I think, maybe spilling into my writing.
Your writing has been a treat, whatever tone. Yeah, so thank you.
Indeed,
Thank you.
indeed.
Mhm.
And I got permission for a little bit more time, so I want to invite another question from the audience. Any takers? Okay, so I have 2 participants who have raised their hands. Um, so Reniki,
Yeah, Reinica. Yeah, I would say
Reinica,
like,
I'm
oh,
sorry. Thank you for
no
correcting me.
worries, no worries. It's like Heineken beer, Reinica. Uh, First, thanks for this. Really good to know you. I feel like I know you, even though we haven't met in person, and hope that we will at some point, and read more of your work. But I was curious about the politics, because of course we're also friends on Facebook, and I have seen some of those posts. And how do you think the work that you're doing, that we're all doing, can be a positive influence in even micro ways in what's going on right now in the political realm? And I'm speaking to you from Alberta, Canada, the Texas of Canada. So lots of also right-wing, quite negative things happening here with LGBTQ rights and such. And I just wondered if you might speak to that. Just perhaps I'm needing a hopeful note, and love to hear you on that.
Yeah, I think sort of, I've written a good bit about sort of the neoliberal takeover of the university system, and that's sort of one of my political battles that I'm still fighting on a daily basis. I have tried to engage in dialogue. I teach dialogue as a method for engaging with people that are different from us. Um, and I've tried doing that, and I think, Robin was asking about legacy. My sons are really good at this. They're young millennials, 29 and 32 years old. They're really good at engaging in conversations. My 29-year-old actually lives in rural North Carolina. He's an organic farmer, so he has to get along with his neighbors who aren't always of the same political stripe as he is. And his reports to me are that people aren't really as divided as our absurd media ecosystem wants us to believe. The loud voices are, the softer voices in the corners of places aren't as divided as the media systems want us to believe. I think there's honestly, I think, in the US at least, they've allowed ratings to take over news. And so it's all about dollars and not about actual truth as much as it could be. So, or as much as it used to be. They used to be the fourth estate, and now I think they're just another player in the political division. And I think social media has really played into this a lot, allowed that division to come up. That's an old divide and conquer strategy that's working. I wish I knew the answer to it, but I do think the incredible capacity of people in this room and other rooms like this to write and to speak eloquently can help, even in small ways. I think I affect my students that way, in talking them through kind of how to listen, how to be with other people. I don't know if that's a very good answer.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. And have you felt, I guess the last question is, have you felt that your tenure has protected you in a way to be able to speak, that you do feel that the job security is there in order to voice and those things and have that dialogue?
Well, I think that I don't care anymore. Like it does, but I don't care. Like there's what they're calling professional track faculty now, which is a fancy way of saying they don't have tenure and they never will. They're on 1-year contracts and they are afraid to speak. And I'm a tenured full professor and I'm not. But I'm not under the impression that they couldn't retaliate and figure out a way to get rid of my whole department if they wanted to. But I'm trying to be the voice against oppression and opportunism and all that sort of stuff in my university. I'm not afraid to ask hard questions. They're afraid to give honest answers, the administrators. But I'm going to still keep holding their feet to the fire. I suppose it protects me, or they think it does. They've reappointed me as department chair, so they think I guess they think I must be doing something that they want to keep, but I don't know what it is, to tell you the truth.
I think I know what it is. You're pretty brilliant. So such a wonderful human. Thank you for sharing these insights into your life and into your career and into your process with us. It's been enlightening and inspiring, and
Thank you.
I am leading it full. So unless there are any final questions or comments, I think we can give those 2 minutes we were given back. And I want to check the chat really quick to make sure I didn't overlook questions people may have put there. Awesome.
There's a
Okay.
lot going on in the chat. It's hard to
It
track.
was. I couldn't. I was trying to stay focused between that and my fur baby pulling at me, you know, but you definitely kept the attention. So thank you so much, Chris. Thank you,
Thank you.
Tony. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Carolyn, for the invitation and opportunity. This was lovely.
Thank you, Robin. I love you.
I love you.